garden, make it twice as big as you think you'll need, and in 2 years it'll be too small anyway. Besides, who wants to mow grass? I think you ought to turn most of your yard into a vegetable garden or something, and you'll enjoy it more. It's just no garden is ever big enough. Okay, let's talk about some specific crops. We're going to talk about tomatoes, we're going to talk about beans, we're going to talk about squash, peppers, eggplant, okra, and anything else anybody wants to know about. But I think probably the most popular vegetable out there has to be the tomato. You can't buy a decent one in the grocery store, and you can grow wonderful tomatoes, but there are several secrets to growing tomatoes. Now, tomatoes, if we get an imbalance, and this is not a disease, it's an imbalance of minerals in the soil, principally calcium and magnesium, if those things get out of whack, your tomatoes on the bottom of the fruit, it'll turn discolored, and then it'll turn black and shriveled, and it looks like the bottom of the tomato is starting to rot. They call that blossom end rot, but that is not a disease. That is merely an imbalance of calcium and magnesium in the soil, and if you suspect you have had a problem with this, or if you totally want to stop it, go to the grocery store and get yourself some Epsom salts. Cheapest thing out there, and Epsom salts rebalance the calcium and magnesium in the soil, and if you put some Epsom salts down, you will never see blossom end rot. If your neighbor has tomatoes that are already up and growing and have blossom end rot because they didn't know about putting it down, well, take your Epsom salts, put about 2 tablespoons to a gallon of water, and water your plants with that. The plants that already have, or the fruit that already has the end rot will not change, but the new growth will not get the blossom end rot. So that's an important thing. In addition to what I was telling you about the fertilizer and the compost, I'll just take a big handful of Epsom salts and just sort of sprinkle it over the area, because we want to change the balance of calcium and magnesium in the whole area of the root zone. We're not going to put this at the bottom of the plant because we're not interested in the plant taking it up. What we're doing is changing the chemical nature of the soil so that you don't get blossom end rot to begin with. So if you're going to grow tomatoes, add a little bit of Epsom salts. Once a year is plenty. Sometimes once every 5 years is plenty. But Epsom salts are cheap and they don't hurt anything. But how many people have had blossom end rot before? Okay. Use your Epsom salts and it'll never be a problem again.
Use it when you plant or when it's fruiting? When the plant is fruiting?
The damage shows up to the fruit. But I put the Epsom salts on before I ever plant.
Before you plant?
Yeah. My Epsom salts went down about 6 weeks ago when I put down the fertilizer and the compost and things like that. Now,
in the hole or just on the top?
Just on the top, just sprinkled all around. When you plant your tomato plant, tomatoes are interesting things in that they are one of the few plants out there that can be planted deeper than they're already growing. You can plant them way up here, and if you get big old overgrown tomatoes, plant them as deeply as you can. Years ago, I worked with a wonderful gentleman up in Bernie named Alton Graham. Alton's still one of the finest people I know. And we used to have some commercial growers that came in, and they always wanted to buy our big old overgrown tomato plants. And I said, how on earth are you going to plant these things? Because some of them were like this tall. And some of them, what they would do is dig a trench, lay the tomatoes sideways in the trench, and bend the top up and cover it up. And it'll grow roots all the way up and down the stem. And another one told me that he let them get really, really dry to where they just got limp. And he said he'd put it in the hole and he'd curl the stem up in the hole and fill it in with soil. And these guys grew excellent tomatoes. So tomatoes are the one and only plant that you can plant deeper and still get very, very good results. Now I want to talk about different kinds of tomatoes. And we're going to divide tomatoes into 3 basic categories. I don't care whether you remember the particular names or not, but it's probably good to know. Tomatoes will either be what we call indeterminate, determinate, or semi-determinate. Now what do those words mean? A determinate tomato grows to a certain size and then stops growing. It's going to produce basically one big crop of fruit, and that's pretty much all you're going to get from it. Why would anybody plant a determinate tomato? I don't know, ask Jerry Parsons, because everything that he talks about is pretty much a determinate tomato. Determinate tomatoes were developed largely for the commercial tomato industry, because these days, with labor costs what they are, nobody wants to go out and pick tomatoes. Your commercial growers would like to have a plant, they could grow it up, it had all the fruit on one time, and then they can have a machine go through the field and pull it out of the ground, pick the tomatoes and all. So determinate tomatoes pretty much produce all their fruit at once, but they produce a heavy crop when they produce. Indeterminate tomatoes are pretty much a vine, and they will grow. Gosh, if you're, I remember driving up over the Parker Ranch on the Big Island of Hawaii one time, and there were cherry tomatoes growing along the side of the road. A friend told me that he once measured, and he found a tomato plant that was 2 miles long. It started here, and it just grew and grew and grew and rooted and all. Indeterminate tomatoes tend to just grow as a vine and just keep on growing and producing as long as you keep the plant healthy. Semi-determinate tomatoes fall somewhere in the middle. They continue to grow and produce, but they're not nearly as vigorous as far as forming a vine. So understand determinate, semi-determinate, and indeterminate tomatoes. Most of the heirloom tomatoes, the old-fashioned varieties, are all indeterminates. Most all of your cherries are indeterminate tomatoes. But people growing in a container, people growing in a limited space. I've known people who grow tomatoes in a hanging basket because they lived in an apartment, didn't have any soil to garden in. That's another place that some of your smaller determinate tomatoes may be just fine because the plant doesn't get just terribly big. But understand the 3 different kinds so that you know what you're getting when you plant. We also divide tomato plants into what we call cherry type tomatoes or small fruited tomatoes and large fruited tomatoes, the slicing tomatoes. What's the difference in these two? Well, large fruited tomatoes tend to be very picky about nighttime temperatures, and they won't set fruit if the nights are too cold, and they won't set fruit if the nights are too hot. We might call them Goldilocks tomatoes. You have to have everything just right if you want them to set fruit. So you plant your bigger fruited tomatoes, you're going to get a heavy crop in the spring, some into early summer, you're going to probably get a heavy crop in the fall, but you're going to be calling me throughout July and August saying, my tomatoes are blooming, but they're not setting any fruit. What's wrong? The nights are too hot. You plant your tomatoes too early in the spring, my tomatoes are blooming, but they're not setting any fruit. The nights are too cold. And don't waste your money on so-called blossom set. This miracle stuff you spray on the flower and it makes it set a tomato. Sure, it sets a tomato about the size of a marble, and it never gets any bigger than that. But it did what it promised. It made it set fruit, but they didn't tell you it was going to grow. They just told you it was going to set fruit. Cherry tomatoes and many of the smaller fruited tomatoes don't pay nearly as much attention to nighttime temperatures. And granted, they don't look as pretty sliced on a hamburger. But if you want lots of fruit, always plant some cherry tomatoes along with your big fruited varieties. The Juliets, the Sweet 100s, and then a bunch of different heirloom tomatoes that make small fruit. But I think they should be included in every garden because, again, go out in the middle of July, pick a quart of tomatoes off of 2 plants. Tomatoes are wonderful things. If you're smarter than your neighbors, you will discover that you can make a lot of friends with a bag full of homegrown tomatoes. Used to be a restaurant in Bernie. I could walk in with a bag of fresh squash and fresh tomatoes, and I got anything on the menu free of charge. So make use of your homegrown produce because it does make a big difference. Yes, sir.
Bob, a celebrity looks like a determinant.
It's a semi-determinate.
Semi?
Yeah. It will continue to produce. Now, the so-called bush celebrity is a fully determinate tomato. And again, it has a place. Doesn't have a place in my garden, but for people who want smaller plants and a lot of produce at once, it's a good thing to have.
How about 444?
Determinate, all the way. Couple of other things about planting tomatoes. Tomatoes are one plant, although it's very true of peppers and eggplant and most other things that you're going to plant. As a plant, there's a wonderful material called rock phosphate. Oh, there it is right there. We used to get something we call colloidal phosphate clay. Some of y'all may still have some of it. Hang on to it because you can't get any more of it. The one mine in the country that's producing it shut down. But this is neat stuff, and it does a couple of things. It helps your tomato plants grow roots, and it helps them put on fruit. Now, I'll tell you a story of what Malcolm Beck did and tell you how to use it and how not to use it. We recommend that when you plant your tomato plants, dig that hole to the appropriate depth and just put a big handful of stuff in the bottom of the hole. Don't mix it in with the soil. Put it in the bottom of the hole and let the plant grow its roots directly through it. The reason for that is if you mix this stuff into our highly alkaline soil, it becomes locked up by the nature of the soil and the plants can't get to it. But when you put it as a glob in the bottom of the hole and the roots go directly through it, they can make use of the different compounds that are in there. Malcolm heard this years ago when he was growing tomatoes commercially, and when he started putting a handful of this in the bottom of the hole, he picked twice as many pounds of fruit from each plant as he did beforehand. He got dollar signs in his eyes. He ordered several tons of the material and he spread it out and tilled it into a couple of acres of ground. He got no increase in production. He went back to the old amount. He didn't get any extra tomatoes whatsoever. And the reason is, if you mix this stuff in the soil, you're totally wasting